It does indeed, for a number of reasons. Allow me just to mention two, for brevity. The first is, if you are a proletarian, if you work in an Amazon warehouse or in a Tesla or a General Motors factory floor, these days you will have seen, if you walk around, if you are allowed to walk around an Amazon warehouse, you will see that workers have one of these attached to their wrist here. And this machine is connected to the same algorithm that is running Amazon, and .com, WS, and all that. And this thing monitors at every nanosecond where the worker is. It instructs the worker, you go to that aisle, pick up that box, bring it here. It knows how long you spent in the toilet. And remarkably, it uses the same reinforcement learning algorithms that brilliant scientists are using in our great research centers in order to design snazzy antibiotics that kill bacteria that human design has not managed to produce yet. It uses exactly the same AI kind of designer tools in order to predict, to prognosticate in which warehouse, which worker is going to have a higher likelihood, propensity towards forming a union, and fires them before they even think of creating a union. Now, so that changes the life of people who work in traditional wage labor settings. But it has a far broader effect. As I said before, when you've got this very large chunk of value taken out of the circular flow of income, and let me be a bit more precise on this. In traditional capitalist sectors, since the Second World War, if you take General Electric or Boeing, or any of the large manufacturers, capitalist manufacturers, around 80% of their revenue was used in order to pay salaries and wages, from the janitor all the way to CEO, 80%. In the case of Facebook, it's 1%. 1%. The rest is siphoned off, goes to the Cayman Islands, through Ireland, through Holland, through Luxembourg, these circuitous pathways that that accountants are very good at creating on behalf of the billionaires, of the oligarchs. So once you take all this money out, the quality of jobs available for a wage diminishes substantially because aggregate demand is depressed. So even if you don't have a phone, there are Luddites. I have friends who refuse to have a smartphone and they want to be disconnected from the internet and so on. You can't be disconnected because even if you work in a manual labor and you have an old Nokia phone that is not connected to the internet, okay, still you are living in this environment in which the quality of jobs is depleted and where power is immensely concentrated in the hands of the very few who live off cloud rent and who are simply not eligible to any kind of control. I mean, Elon Musk is just very much in the news today because he went into bed with Donald Trump in a rather unsavory set of circumstances. But that we're missing the point that it's not Elon Musk. It's it's Google, it's Microsoft, it's Alibaba, it's Tencent in China. It is the form of cloud capital which creates a new regime, essentially. And it's not a personal matter, it's not a matter of personal preferences. Well, we all know what happened in 2007, 2008. A 20-year period of irrational exuberance, which was essentially Wall Street printing its own money. to cut a long story short, to keep it very technically minimal. Essentially, they were printing their own money. Why did they do that? Because after 1971, after the United States became a deficit country, it went from a trade surplus to a trade deficit, and with the Nixon shock in 1971, essentially what every government in Washington did was to intentionally boost the trade deficit. And the trade deficit became a remarkable tool for the United States of enhancing American hegemony, which is crazy. It sounds crazy because never before has a deficit enhanced the hegemonic power of the hegemon. It has done the opposite. It brought down the Roman Empire, the Dutch Empire, the British Empire. But in the case of the American Empire, of the United States, it enhanced its hegemony. But what that did, man, how did it do it? The trade deficit sucked into the United States the net exports of the Germans, of the Japanese, later of the Chinese. And then what did these capitalists, non-American capitalists, do with the dollars that they were paid? They took it to New York. So there was a tsunami of capital from the 1970s all the way to today coming into New York City, into Wall Street. And of course, if you give a Wall Street financier a few billion to play with every day, even if it's only for 10 minutes, they find ways to financialize it, to build bets on that money, derivatives, CDOs, CDO squares, CDSs, and so on, right? And so effectively they were minting their own money. But they overdid it. After the Clinton administration effectively unleashed them completely from all the impediments and the shackles that the New Deal and the 1960s Bretton Woods system had imposed on the bankers, that went through Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, appointed by, who else? Barack Obama. So they went crazy. They went berserk. To give our audience an example, in the year 2001, total planetary income was around 50. Forget the zeros. It was around 50 trillion. It's around 50 in 2000, 2001, 50. The derivative trades were 70. Okay, that's in 2000. By 2007, total income, planetary income, went from 50 to 70, and the derivative trade went from 70 to 780. So there wasn't enough room on planet Earth. So they came crashing down. In a complete state of panic, the leaders of the West, presidents, prime ministers, and their central bankers, gathered in London in April of 2009, if you remember. And they all agreed to refloat finance, essentially socialism for the bankers. At the same time, every single Western jurisdiction imposed austerity on its people. So you have this combination of austerity for the many, depressing demand for goods and services, and lots of money for big capital. Because this, all the money that the central banks were printing and giving to the bankers of Wall Street, of Frankfurt, of London, of Paris, and so on, was flowing to big business. Now, traditional big businesses like General Motors, General Electric, Volkswagen, and so on, they looked outside the window of the skyscrapers and they saw impecunious masses. These people have no money. As if I'm going to invest in production lines that would produce, snazzy, new, expensive products. They won't be able to afford it, the many. But they still took the money from the central bank and rushed to the stock exchanges to buy back their own shares. So, if you are Volkswagen, you don't want to produce expensive cars because the many can't afford them, but the central bank gives you free money. So what do? You buy Volkswagen shares. Similar in the United States. That creates no investment, no good quality jobs, but it creates a very nice little earner for the capitalists. And here is the crux. The only capitalists who actually took this money and invested it in machines were the Jeff Bezoses, the Elon Musks, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Nvidias, the Intels of the world. 9 out of every $10 that they invested in cloud capital, in Meta, in Google and so on, 9 out of every $10 has come from money that was printed by the Fed, by the central bank.
And as you point out in the book, they didn't make profits.
They didn't need to make profits.
Yeah.
Because it's all rent. Yeah, that's the thesis in my book. So essentially, society paid for the cloud capital of the new masters of the universe, who are no longer the bankers so much, but they are the owners of cloud capital, whom I have decided to call cloudalists because I like the term. It comes from Star Trek, but that's another story. Capital has always been around, even before capitalism. It's not a new thing. A fishing rod is a capital good in the sense that it was produced in order to produce something else. You know, a catch of fish. A tractor was produced not in order to be driven around, but in order to produce corn or wheat. So, in that sense, well before, thousands of years before we had capitalism, we had capital as a produced means of production. But what lives inside here, inside our phones, in our laptops, in the cell towers, the server farms, the thousands of miles of optical fiber cables, what I call cloud capital, is a produced means, is an automated network made up of machinery, just like a railway network, but it is not a means of production. It is a produced means of something different, of behavioral modification. So when you have Siri on your iPhone or Google Assistant or Amazon's Alexa, essentially this is an interface between you and the cloud capital owned by these conglomerates, by Jeff Bezos, for instance, in the case of Alexa. And what happens there is quite magical and disturbingly novel, because essentially you're training the machine to know you. And you are training it as it gets to know you, to train you, to get it to know you better. And at some point, it knows you so well that it gives you good advice, like, when Amazon recommends books, it's usually spot on, or when Spotify recommends music. And, and we are gullible human beings, understandably, and it makes sense. If anyone gives you good recommendations, you start taking them seriously, you start trusting them. And then at some point, it can impute desires and preferences into your mind, your heart. And this is the most fascinating aspect of it, once you want this electric bicycle, for instance, that it has convinced you want, it sells it to you directly, bypassing every market, every shopping mall you can imagine. Meanwhile, you, by training it, by uploading music, photographs, video, and so on, you're adding to that cloud capital, and that has never happened before. So two things have never happened before in the history of humankind, in capitalism and before capitalism. The first is that you have an automated system which modifies your behavior, an automated system, not some philosopher, some crank, some preacher, but an automated machine that modifies your behavior without any human being entering in this behavioral modification exercise. And the second thing that happens is, beyond the fact that it sells to you things directly bypassing capitalist markets, you are helping the owner of that cloud capital accumulate more cloud capital through your free voluntary labor. Ladies and gentlemen, as I like to say, welcome to techno-feudalism. This is no longer capitalism, because capitalism, however you see it from a left-wing point of view, a right-wing point of view, it has two pillars. It's got markets and profit. That's the essence of capitalism, right? But now markets have been replaced by these digital platforms that look like markets but are not markets. They're more like digital or cloud fiefdoms, like Amazon.com or Alibaba, where you have a digital fence keeping within it producers, consumers, artisans, intellectuals, and we are all essentially producing value for the owner of that digital fiefdom, Jeff Bezos in this particular case, in the case of Amazon, who charges ground rent, but of course it's cloud rent, it's not ground rent. And therefore, profits that are created by the old-fashioned traditional capitalist sector are siphoned off by the Bezoses of the world as cloud capital. And that is of profound importance, not only in the way that we live and in the way we produce and reproduce our material and intellectual conditions, but also it's of profound significance when it comes to our macroeconomy. Because, Chris, when about 20-30%, this is my estimation, of GDP, of value produced in our advanced economies, is siphoned off the circular flow of income by the owners of cloud capital, that creates a massive further reduction in aggregate demand, And that creates pressures on the Fed to produce more money against the edicts of the anti-inflationary process. It creates huge political clashes between the United States and China because they are effectively the only two owners of large-scale cloud capital. So as I was thinking all that, I was thinking, this is no longer capitalism, folks. It's something far worse. Labor that can be automated ceases to be human labor. From time immemorial, this is not a new thing. So, for instance, even back during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, take a textile factory in Manchester, in England. Right? The jobs that could be done individually by workers, especially women, who would be given a sewing machine and say, look, you produce these pieces of cloth. Any such job that could be individuated essentially was shipped out of the factory. These women were asked to stay at home. They were given a sewing machine at home, and they were asked to produce them at home. And then they were being paid as contractors. They were being paid piece rates per item. They weren't being paid wages. They weren't being paid vacation time. They were not being given any health cover. They were being shipped out and treated like individual producers, individuated producers. So all jobs that can be atomized and individuated essentially drop out of the waged labor process. With cloud capital, this is now growing exponentially. What happens is, for instance, I don't know whether you are familiar with that. I mentioned this in the book. It is quite terrifying. There is a website owned by Amazon called the Mechanical Turk. As we speak today, I checked it. 100 million people worked on it, actually labored on it. So what happens is you log on and the algorithm matches you with particular jobs, not employers, but jobs. Employers dish out these jobs that can be done at home. It can be accounting jobs or counting the number of cars in a deck of cards and separating them like an idiotic machine from buses, or writing reports, given data, or doing data analytics, and you get paid by the job. And these people, of course, have absolutely no social security cover. They can be all over the world. Sometimes they're being paid in Amazon tokens, so they can buy stuff from Amazon.com, so they're not even being paid in wages.
It's like script. It's like the miners used to get script.
It's exactly
where they could only shop at the overpriced company store.
Indeed, this is exactly what it is. So this is one example. But jobs that require brainstorming, that require inspiration. So, for instance, let's say you have an architect's office, and you have 5, 10 highly qualified architects, and the office is competing for a large project to build the airport somewhere, or a new modern art museum somewhere, and they need to brainstorm there. Well, that is what I call experiential labor. It's labor which is, in William Morris's terms, fulfilling labor. It is creative labor. That cannot be replaced yet by artificial intelligence, by algorithms, and that is maintained as part of the wage labor that remains within the broader kernel of techno-feudalism.
But although, as you point out, it's not valued or compensated.
It depends on the bargaining power between the owners of the architectural office and the architects. And this is
you do talk about Mad Men, about that. I haven't watched it, but you talk about this character in Mad Men who apparently is drunk half the day, but he's brilliant, as a kind of example of that, experiential quality, that ability, that inspiration, that kind of vision. And so, what happened? We'll talk about that bifurcation, because you need it, don't you? I mean, isn't it essential, experiential labor?
Less and less. I use Mad Men, the serial, featuring the fictional Don Draper, who is he represents the great advertisers of yesteryear, the 1950s and 60s, those men, and they were men mostly, some very few women, who sat around and drank their bourbon and eventually would come up with brilliant advertising campaigns for Coca-Cola, for Bethlehem Steel, for McDonald's, for whatever. And that would, those ads were necessary at the time after the Second World War, when you had the massive corporations that emerged from the Second World War as part of the war economy, America's war economy, and they had a remarkable productive capacity because factories became exceptionally efficient during the war, and then with the conversion of the arms industry into civilian industry, the problem the United States had in the late 40s, early 50s, late 50s, was that those factories could produce a lot more than what the American public wanted to or could consume. So these corporations needed people like Don Draper because they needed to produce the stuff and the demand for the stuff through advertising, through using the new medium of television back then, the great billboards on the motorways, on the highways, and so on. But two things have happened since then. Well, the first thing is that through the creation of cloud capital, the Don Drapers of the world, those haphazard and erratic, brilliant opinion makers and advertising geniuses, they became automated. So today, you've got bots doing their job. Today, with the decline of the television audience and the immersion of society into cloud capital, whether it is Instagram or TikTok or whatever, Facebook, Snapchat, and so on and so forth, the Don Drapers are being replaced by bots that do highly targeted campaigns. Each one of us, at different points of the day, get tailor-made advertisements which are in a dialectical relationship with us. We train them to train us, to train them to train us, to convince us that we want something. Don Draper couldn't do that. At this level of, granular level of dialectical interactivity with each one of us, not each one of us, but every mood that we might find ourselves in. So the Don Drapers, the experiential labor of the Don Drapers is increasingly a thing of the past. And at the same time, the great conglomerates that I mentioned, the Coca-Colas, the Fords, the General Motors, the General Electrics, and so on, they're becoming a minuscule power in our society. If you look at the New York Stock Exchange today, Chris, and you take out the cloud capital from it, the Magnificent Seven, as you Americans like to call them, what's left? Pretty minuscule amount of value. These large corporations, yesterday I was looking at the numbers, I was astounded to find that Palantir, Peter Thiel's genocidal company of waging war through AI and drones and apps, has a higher capitalization in the New York Stock Exchange than Lockheed Martin. That is, I think, I don't need to say more. Well, I'm saying this as a leftist, by the way, right? This is
me too. So we're in the same club.
Self-lamentation. When the left began kicking and screaming against capitalism at the very beginning, it was an emancipatory project. Marx and the Marxists and the trades unionists were all about liberating workers from the tyranny of exploitation. It was about liberation. It wasn't about equality. It wasn't about fairness. Maybe they had a lot of those slogans as well, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. But Marx, who for me was an eye-opener, was actually against the idea of equality. He would ask pertinent questions such as equality of what? You know, if you have a disabled person, a disabled person needs more resources in order to have the standard of life that we have. So you can't ask for equality is not the issue. Liberation from constraints, liberation from exploitation, from the extractive power of the powerful, that's what the left should be all about. So the criticism of the left initially waged against capitalism was that capitalism restricts the freedom not just of the workers, but also of the capitalists. There is a beautiful, wonderful piece in this text in Marx's Grundrisse where he's waxing lyrical about the poor capitalist, how the capitalist goes to bed at night, unable to sleep because he's worried about bankruptcy. And even if he's a good man, he has to exploit his workers because if he doesn't squeeze the living daylights out of them, then he will become like them. So this is a tragedy for the capitalist class. So it's a purely humanist liberation movement. That's what the left used to be. Even when you look at it from the perspective of the feminists, of feminism. Feminism, remember what it was used to be called? Women's lib, women's liberation. It wasn't about quotas that the CIA torturers in Guantanamo Bay had to be 50% men, 50% women, or that there should be, transgender toilets in Guantanamo Bay. That was never the issue for the women's liberation, the gay and lesbian liberation movement. So we of the left used to be all about liberty. And then we got stuck around the First World War. Around the First World War, 1912, 1913, 1914, the Great War split the left between those who were supporting the Soviet system and the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats became effectively ethno-nationalists, especially in places like Germany. They took the side of the bourgeoisie in that crazy trench warfare that was pathetic and pointless. The Soviet side, very soon after 1917, lost the verve, the urge to liberate workers from the tyranny of some boss.
Well, there was that brief period with the Soviets where they achieved it.
2 years.
And then, of course, then the Bolsheviks destroyed it, which is why Chomsky calls the Bolsheviks counter-revolutionaries. But they did achieve it. That's the tragedy.
For 2 years. And this is exactly what Noam says, that for 2 years there were worker councils and there was, the idea was that now workers will have democratically to control their work, their workplace. They would elect their foremen and forewomen, and then after that, of course, it all became top down. And in the end, allow me to bring it back to my book. If you look at Gosplan, the Ministry of Planning, of Economic Planning in Moscow, what it tried to do, Chris, and this fascinates me and horrifies me and excites me and at the same time depresses me, is what Gosplan tried to do. It tried to do what the algorithm of Jeff Bezos is doing in Amazon.com. Essentially, the idea behind Gosplan, which was a very fascinating project if you look at it from a technical point of view, from a mathematical point of view, and I spent quite a few years when I was a young man studying it. What Gosplan tried to do was to replace the market by matching consumers with producers. And from the center, from Moscow, sending signals to a factory producing shoes, you will produce so many shoes at that price, and trying to match those shoes with the demand from consumers. But Amazon does this perfectly well. Back then, they didn't have the all singing, all dancing algorithm that now Amazon has. So in a sense, Amazon and central planning in the Soviet Union have a great deal of commonality. The difference is, of course, that in the case of Amazon, it's owned by Jeff Bezos, and it is optimized, the code, the computer program, the algorithm is optimized in order to maximize his cloud rent, whereas in the case of the Soviet Union was there to optimize according to the will of the Central Committee. So once we justified the death of the works councils, of the liberation of workers from not being the decision makers, as the left, that's what happened in the communist East. In the West, we also ditched freedom because the social democrats who became quite significant and even won governments in places like Germany, and Austria, and Britain in the 1960s and 70s. Again, they replaced liberty with the concept of social justice, of taking some of the surplus value accumulated by the capitalists and giving it to the workers.